Okay, it's 5:30, so maybe we'll get started. My name is Laura Kaifas. I'm with the Neighborhood Services Office here for the City of Tempe, and I'll be serving as your host today. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about the new water rate study. For those of you who haven't been with us before, the way we typically do this is there's a short presentation, and then we hold questions till the end. You can either type them in the chat and I'll read them, or if you prefer to ask them yourself, that's just fine. You can just raise your hand and unmute yourself. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome and thank you for joining us today and attending this public meeting. Today we'll be discussing Tempe's 2022 water, wastewater, and stormwater rate study. I'm Steve White, Municipal Utilities Business Manager, and joining me from the city today is Tom Dunsing, who's our Deputy City Manager, interim. We also have Tara Ford with us today. She's our interim Municipal Utilities Director. And Mark Weber is also here with us today. He's our interim Deputy Municipal Utilities Director over the Water Utilities Division. Also joining us today is Kyle Stevens. He's our senior consultant from Stantec. He's been our senior consultant, I think, going back to 2015, Kyle, if that sounds accurate. So he's been with us for quite a while, and they've done a fantastic job working with us on our previous rate studies to date. Kyle will be presenting the bulk of the presentation tonight. But before he starts and before I turn it over to him, I'd just like to share a few thoughts on the rate study and really why we conduct rate studies as a utility. So with that said, the purpose of rate studies is really to understand what it costs for as a utility to provide water service and wastewater service. So, and it's integral to not only understand the operating costs of providing that this current year, but it's also important to understand that in future years, which provides us a context to a second important reason why we conduct rate studies is something called cost of service or cost allocation. And Kyle's going to go into this to more detail as far as how we do that. But the importance of that is we are essentially billing customers based on their use of the water utility system and the wastewater utility system. So their use, their water demand characteristics, or their strengths and loading from the wastewater side go into what they're charged. So they're not charged for more or less. It's a fair and equitable cost-based method that we go about identifying how much of our revenue needs to come from single family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, or landscape customers. So with that said, there's a second piece of this study this year, which may sound new, and that's because it is new. If you've participated in the past, you've noticed that we've had water and wastewater rate studies, but this year we're adding one. We're adding a stormwater rate study. So stormwater infrastructure obviously is, the city has stormwater infrastructure for rain, precipitation incidents and so forth, but those costs are really embedded both in the utility but also in other city costs. So we're looking at peeling those costs away from the city and the utility with the intent of essentially establishing or proposing, if you will, a stormwater rate. And that's part of what we're looking at potentially doing. We'll be providing options to council as we go through this process and better understand and identify those costs and where those costs are at currently within the city or the utility. And certainly we'll have more robust communication and conversations with stakeholders as we move along in this process. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Kyle to start the remainder of the presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I want to run through a presentation we put together that really covers the rate study at a 30,000 foot view, and we'll dive into a few of the finer details on some of the aspects we'll be covering tonight. So from an agenda standpoint, we'll be looking at the revenue sufficiency, cost of service, rate design, and then we'll cover the timeline of the rate study, public outreach, and then we'll open it up for discussion or any questions on the material covered this evening. So with that, I'll jump into it. This first slide really helps me tee up the issue of what is a rate study. And I think one of the best ways to think about it is a series of interconnected investigations. So first, we're going to look into revenue sufficiency. That's a fancy way of saying how much does it cost? Water, wastewater, there are no tax dollars involved here. All of the revenues are associated with user fees. And so we need to determine what are the total annual cost of running the system and also projecting that out over a multi-year period. So we'll be looking at 5 and 10 years into the future to see how those costs are anticipated to evolve over time. Once we've established that baseline, we'll move into the cost allocation. And what we're really discussing there is from whom. So we have several customer classes set up on both the water and wastewater side. So examples are single family, multifamily, landscape, industrial, commercial. And what we want to do is look at the system's cost drivers and how those customers are impacting those cost drivers. Next, once we establish the cost allocation, we'll go into rate design and we'll think about the different objectives that go into creating the actual rates and charges that show up on a customer's bill and generate that bill to collect the revenue for the utility. So a little bit more context on the broader industry that we're in here with water and wastewater services. Many people are very familiar with the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And on the left side of this slide, I've taken the annual change in the CPI from 2000. That's been about 2.4%. It's been running a little higher lately, but on average about 2.4%. For some context, in the utility sphere, the agencies that track cost actually track individually water and wastewater costs to the household. Those costs have increased at 4.7% over that same time period. And so utilities have a very capital intensive budget, and they're buying a package or a basket of goods that's a bit different than a consumer. And those things have moved up in cost at a bit of a higher rate, almost double the overall inflation we see in the economy. And so just gives us a little perspective about cost and the pressures that are on utilities. Additionally, this is a kind of geographical overlay that gives us some comparisons to what utility costs are for water, wastewater, and stormwater services across the country. And we've got some representative cities in here. I think there are a couple conclusions that come to my mind when I look at a graphic like this. So the cost can vary. So in this particular graphic, this is all for the same amount of usage, 6,000 gallons of usage per month of water and wastewater services. You can see the variance in Seattle at 209 to Tempe, that's $43 currently. So there's a lot of variation in age of infrastructure, source of supply for water, treatment on the wastewater side that all goes into what the end cost is for the consumer. I would also point out that in the pie charts behind each municipality up here, we've got blue for water, green for wastewater, and purple for stormwater. Now, Steve mentioned the stormwater aspect of our study. What I would point to here is a number of communities have actually looked at that cost and do have a standalone fee to recover those costs associated with stormwater in a bit of a different way than we recover costs for water and wastewater services. So what we'll go into next is dive into the revenue sufficiency. And this is best thought about as arranging pieces of the puzzle, if you will. So this diagram right here, in the middle, we've got the annual revenue requirement. How much money does it cost? And in order to arrive at that, we've got to bring several pieces to the table. So personal services, there's a great amount of personnel, specialized personnel that goes into keeping these systems operational 24/7. We've got expenditures, vehicles, and specialized equipment. Some debt service associated with ongoing capital projects. As I mentioned, these are very capital intensive enterprises. We're investing in not only treatment plants, but also the large network of pipes that stretches across the community. And then additionally, we've got reserve contributions up there. So we've got to consider financial policies. How much money should we hold in the bank on times? How much coverage do we need on debt? Things like that to ensure we're sustainable over time. And all of that adds up to the annual revenue requirement. And then we're going to take that and play it forward for 5 and 10 years to understand how those costs may change over time and ensure that rates are sustainable over that period and these services can be provided over time. So with regards to water services, this next slide, I've just tried to capture the idea of what it costs on an annual basis. And so on the right side, we've got a cup of water here, and we've broken out some of those key categories of annual costs. So for debt service, it's roughly $23 million a year in the current fiscal year. The community is planning on investing by the end of the fiscal year, roughly $27 million in capital investment. And for operations, personnel, small capital outlay, it's roughly $34 million. Now, with regards to wastewater, we've got a tub here and draining a tub to the system. The annual debt service cost is roughly $16 million. There will be capital invested this year of $16 million, and the operating costs are $14 million. With regards to stormwater, we'll be doing something a little bit different than on the water and wastewater side. So water and wastewater are well-established utilities in Tempe, where stormwater currently, our first exercise is to identify where the service is provided. It's provided in a number of departments across the city and what those services cost. An example of some of those services are included here, like street sweeping, asset management, some of the capital projects associated with reducing flooding. Those costs are spread. For example, some of the operations is in water and sewer right now, where the capital projects are primarily funded from GEO bonds that go out to referendum to the voters. Next, we'll move into the cost of service once we've established the revenue requirement. And the cost of service, this is a framework I'll talk about of how we'll be conducting this study. And we'll be following the M1 manual, which is essentially the industry standard of how to allocate cost for the water system into several different categories. Now, I like to think of this particular slide as following a drop of water. So on the left side of the screen is a source of supply. We've then got to treat that water, then send it out to the system for transmission, distribution, and finally have some customer costs related to billing, collections, customer calls or inquiries. So what we'll be doing is first identifying for each of those functions how much they cost on an annual basis. And then next, associating them with the bottom portion of this graphic, which are what types of demands the system is serving. So a water system from an engineering perspective is set up and stands ready to serve several types of demands. So one is known as average day demands. That's kind of the overall average demands in a year you can think of. But then on top of that, we've got to stand ready to meet some more peak demands. And so maximum day demands and peak hour demands. Best way to think about these two are really some of the seasonal demands, especially on the Tempe system that we see over the summer months, where customers oftentimes demand quite a bit more water than in other months of the year. And the system, again, has to be built and constructed to be able to supply those demands. So we'll be categorizing that amount of cost associated with that. And then finally, customer cost. Now, once we have those costs functionalized and identified, one of the really unique parts about this study is the amount of data that we have available to understand how customers are utilizing the system and how we can best proportionally spread the cost of running the system to the users in proportion to how they use it. So the data that I'm now presenting on the screen comes from the city's advanced metering infrastructure. These are the new digital meters that were installed several years back, which collect millions and millions of data points with regards to customers' usage. And this graphic right here shows over a year's time period. This was actually from the last study we did in 2019. We're just updating this data now, but shows those seasonal demands very clearly here. If you look on the left, starting in January, going to the middle, we can see some very much peaking activity on a lot of the customer activities where they're demanding a lot more water in the seasonal months. And so through cost of service, we'll be connecting the cost to run the system to the customers who use those demands and place those demands on the system. With regards to wastewater, it's a little bit different, but very similar in the sense that we have a book from WEF, Manual 27, which lays out a framework for us to work through and think about the way that customers utilize the wastewater system. And so from a functional standpoint, there is flow, so the amount or volume of wastewater on the system, and then secondarily, strength, what's in the wastewater. The technical terms for strength are COD, chemical oxygen demand, and TSS, total suspended solids. What we'll be doing in this particular study is looking at the wastewater cost, breaking up these categories of cost into flow, strength, and then customer. We will then, Tempe has a study underway right now, which is much like the water data I just talked about, which will analyze and understand different customers' contributions to the system from this strength standpoint, where we again can try to make a very strong connection using relevant, updated local data in order to best update and do a cost allocation on the wastewater side to understand how customers are causing a cost and using the system fundamentally. Now, at the end of a cost allocation process, when we get to our results, it looks very much like this. So I've put this graphic up, and when we do this analysis, we'll have several of these come out for the water and wastewater side. So I'll talk through it. In the orange is the cost of service. So for each customer class, down at the bottom, single family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, and landscaping, we get an orange bar that tells us how much it costs in total on an annual basis to serve that customer class. We'll then contrast that to the black bar, which is how much revenue we're currently receiving from all the customers that are in that category. Now, the ideal thing would be to see the two bars very much in alignment, where the height of the two is almost identical. Oftentimes, though, what we'll find is that there might be slight differences between the cost to serve and the amount of revenue. And as we move into the next process of rate design, we'll want to think about how to best ensure or make sure that we can true up to cost of service. And the fact that Tempe does these studies every 2 years, especially on the water side, these costs are always staying very much in a line because we're truing them up every couple of years to ensure that we're matching the changes in cost and the changes in the way that customers utilize the system. So with that, I'll move to rate design. And in rate design, I think it's always good to start off with this kind of a diagram to talk about the different objectives. Some of those may be fighting against one another. Some of those may go along with one another. And what I mean by that are items like simplicity. So oftentimes we want rates to be understandable and very simple, but at the same time, we also want them to be proportional. So we want them to be sensitive enough that if there are very different users on the system, the rates can pick that up, and they're complex enough and sophisticated enough to understand that something's happening there that causes the system to incur cost, and the charges are representative of that. Additionally, as I mentioned at the top of this, we start from the cost of service. And once we've identified how much each rate class has to pay into the system proportional to their costs, want to use that as a target. And then finally, industry standards. So we have a number of industry standards out there nationally. We also want to factor in local precedent for rate setting to ensure we're meeting all of the different criteria out there and really creating sustainable rates for the long term. Now, with regards to the building blocks of rates, there really are fundamentally two types for water and wastewater. There are fixed charges that are the same each month for a customer, and there are those that vary by usage or volume on the system. And so I'll talk about real quick how we think about the costs that actually support those two types of rates. And so on the left, you'll see here in the water building blocks, I've attached those cost components that I was talking about in a second ago. So we've got customer cost. So those customer costs are not really related to volume. So those are oftentimes best captured in those fixed fees each month that a customer pays into the system. Additionally, average day costs, that foundation of providing a volumetric service at the average volume, some of that oftentimes is best to include in the fixed charge and a bit in the volumetric. But when we think about the peak demands, the max day, the peak hour, some of those key functions the system's supporting, those are always best recovered on the volumetric side of the equation, as those fundamentally vary with usage and the demands placed on the system. With regards to how do we actually bill the billing units for these two, a fixed service charge is typically going to be based on the meter size or the connection size to the utility system, and that's represented oftentimes in inches. So for instance, a 5/8 residential meter is a very common one in Tempe for a single family home. Commercial enterprises might have a larger meter because they're placing larger demands on the system. When we talk about volume, we're talking about thousands of gallons that used within a monthly period. And that's how the bill is looked at and created based on the rates here. So When we go to the next slide here, these are the current water rates that we're starting with as we move into this rate study and analyze any potential modifications or recommendations. And so on the left side are those fixed service charges I just talked about. An average home, as I mentioned, is a 5/8, that's $13.55 a month, but you can see the scaling here. So if you have a larger connection to the system, the thought process behind there is you can place larger demands on the system. And so the fee scales on a monthly basis. And these on the left, again, are before any usage on the system. Then on the right side, we have a series of volumetric charges, and they vary by customer class. So within the single family class, there are 5 tiers that apply to usage. And what I mean by these tiers is, for instance, on tier 1, that is all usage in a month that's between 6 or less than 6,000 gallons, and it's all billed at $1.90. Now, if you go above 6,000 gallons, you would fall into tier 2, and those additional gallons, so that next additional gallon would be charged at $2.91 up to 12,000 gallons. Once we go above 12,000 gallons, we then fall into tier 3, and if we exceed that, into tier 4 and 5. With regards to the other customer classes, multifamily, commercial, construction, industrial, and landscaping, their rates are uniform rates for all usage within a monthly period, again, tied back to the cost of service that we were just discussing and the unique demands that those customer classes place on the system. With regards to wastewater, it's a relatively similar configuration. On the fixed service charges, they again will scale by meter size, the residential being a 5/8 at $10.30 a month currently. And then on the volumetric side, what we'll have is a series of uniform rates for each customer class that again is tied now thinking about the amount of volume, but also the strength that's in that wastewater. Now for the single family, there are a few key considerations. So Tempe applies a winter averaging program. And what we mean by that is your wastewater for a residential household, your wastewater billing units are based on the flows from, or the usage in the water meter from January, February, and March averaged together. We take 70% of that. And then if it's above 12,000, we cap it at 12,000. And all of those actions are aimed to ensure that we're trying to get out any irrigation or seasonal usage that may occur that's not going back to the wastewater system. And so just trying to ensure that we're as equitably as we can billing those customers. And then you can see down below with multifamily, commercial, we have a number of different categories there that have different return flow factors and different rates per 1,000 gallons, again, dependent on that flow and the strength of that wastewater, which we'll be looking at in this study to update and analyze. Now, one of the things in a rate study that we always do is some benchmarking activities to, again, understand how our services compare to other peer municipalities. This particular slide captures a current snapshot of other AMWA communities, that is the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association within the Valley. On the left side of the screen is an average single family household. And so this is 10,000 gallons of water, 7,000 gallons of wastewater usage in a month. And what I take away from this particular survey is among the peers in the Valley, Tempe has very competitive price services for this user level. So you can see they're only one rung above the bottom currently. And then on the right side of this survey, what we've done is the exact same survey, same communities, but we've increased the usage level. So looking at a larger volume user, 75,000 gallons of usage, 35,000 gallons of wastewater. Again, when we stack Tempe up against other communities, you can see Tempe's in the lowest 1/3 of providers within the community. Now, again, comparisons are always hard. Everyone has different systems and different needs on those systems, but this is always helpful to put into context the cost of services on a monthly basis. So with regards to the stormwater fee, that is the new component to this particular rate study. When we talk about the fees, what we are talking about in this particular study is really first, as we get our arms around those costs and services, we'll then want to understand the community's options for potentially creating a stormwater fee. And so the kind of Venn diagram up here at the top in blue talks about a lot of the objectives when we look at a stormwater fee. We want to make sure there's fairness and equity. in a way it's charged, it's simple. We have defensibility and ease of understanding. And then we also want to take into account the availability of data. This is a brand new fee, and so we've got to make sure we've got the data available to actually charge it. I've put down on the very bottom some thoughts about how other communities evaluate charging stormwater parcels. So this is why you would separate out a stormwater fee, because it's very different than, say, water or wastewater services. Really talking about reducing flooding and how do parcels impact the flooding dynamics in a given community. So many communities will look at taxable value. Say if it's still in the general fund, they're funding stormwater oftentimes with a lot of taxable value. Once it's moved out to its own fee, though, they'll use maybe a flat fee, a same fee across all customers. They'll use dwelling units, potentially the number of residential units in a given parcel. And then we get into some really parcel specific characteristics like gross area. How big is a parcel? Pervious area, how much is still natural and allows for the percolation of water? And then finally, the one that's most used in the entire industry is impervious area, which is the hard surface cover on a parcel that creates more runoff than, say, a natural parcel. And so we'll be looking in this particular study to think carefully about what is a good fit for Tempe and what would be a set of policy options that we can present to council to consider on this topic. Finally, want to just mention the timeline. So a rate study such as the one that's getting kicked off here the last month and this month is a multi-month process to analyze data and come up with results. We're currently in March and April, so we've introduced this study. We're in this public campaign today to really fundamentally solicit feedback and thoughts on the study. And then we'll be moving into the March and July period where we'll be very analytically heavy, building models, looking at data, coming up with the modifications and recommendations to get ready for an August, September meeting where we can present the really salient findings of this study and provide public outreach to gather feedback on the recommendations. And I would also add at that time, we'll oftentimes be able to really help customers understand how the different modifications will potentially impact their bill. And then finally, in November and October, we would have a presentation at a council meeting for the consideration of rate adoption, modifications to the rate. And if it's approved and adopted, we would then have an additional public outreach campaign to help customers anticipate the potential changes to their bill that will be forthcoming. And the earliest that these rates will be in effect would be January 2023. And I would also add that we do through, I believe it's April 24th, have a public survey, online survey available for the residents of Tempe to go do and fill out and provide feedback that way as well. And so with that, I'll end the presentation, Steve, and I think we're going to open it up to any questions or discussion on the topic tonight.
Thank you, Kyle. Appreciate the presentation. As Kyle just mentioned, we're going to open the meeting for questions and discussion. I'd just like to add before we begin, we had a previous public meeting earlier today at noon. The video and summary of that meeting will be placed on our utility rate study webpage. So if you wanted to see any comments or questions and the responses to those questions, they'll be there as well from earlier meeting. So we do appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your comments and feedback and are happy to answer any questions you have. Laura, would you?
Yes, I am ready for you guys. So far, my screen is staying with us, but it's getting a little sketchy again. We have a question though from Bryce. It says, it sounds like you're justifying rate hikes. Why now and not the years in the past when we had record rainfalls?
So yeah, I can start off on that question. It's not necessarily, I think, justifying rate hikes as much as taking a deep investigation in order to anticipate cost changes over time and to ensure that rates are fully sustaining these operations that are fundamental to the community, the quality of life services for the community. And from time to time, rate increases are required. As I kind of pointed out early on in that CIP, the CIP chart, utilities face a lot of cost pressures over time. And so the underlying cost of service here does change from year to year, and that does oftentimes require rate increases. One thing that we look at, though, from time to time is how to, as best as we can, make those rate increases predictable and as low as possible for the community.
Okay, I think we had some folks wanting to unmute. They weren't raising hands, but I think that was their intent. Nancy, I believe, did you have a question?
Yes. How is it that Tempe's rates seem to be so very cheap in comparison with the other cities? Have we been not as responsive to the actual costs? Maybe someone can comment in that regard.
So I can start off, Steve. One thought that I have that comes to mind, and I mentioned peer comparisons are always hard, right? So systems are very different, have different densities, different age of the system. One idea that comes to my mind, though, that's pretty unique to Tempe is that Tempe has a very robust supply portfolio and has invested in supply and actually gets their supply a little bit differently than a lot of valley communities, which is one of the really key cost drivers in some other areas that we see. And so most of the water comes from the Salt River as opposed to the Central Arizona project. That's just one idea. There are also differences in the rate structure. That's why we tried to compare different volumes and look at how the rates impact customers at different volumes. But I think there's a number of different drivers that come into that comparison and lead to differences.
Nancy, did you have anything else on that?
That was all. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark, I believe you were wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, I apologize. I couldn't figure out on this Zoom how to raise my hand on the screen, so I apologize. But on Kyle, on slide 13, where you had the cost loaded across the chart, does that compare cumulative? Like, for instance, is it comparing 100,000 single-family homes to 10,000 commercial users?
Are you talking about the AMI data we're using in the study?
Well, is in this case, you've got single-family homes as the key driver. Is it all the single-family homes in Tempe, or is it comparing one single-family home to one commercial user?
Yeah, no, great question. So what we're actually looking at here is the entirety of each customer class. And we're looking at how their volumes change throughout the year and how they're effectively using the capacity of the utility system, the cost, the drivers of the utility system. And in each customer class through this process gets their proportional share of those costs based on these usage dynamics. And so it includes all single family homes, all commercial establishments, all landscape and industrial users in this particular graphic, which is really a ratio of how much their average usage changes to their peak usage.
So if I'm reading this correctly, you're telling me that the average single family home cost more to support than one commercial or one industrial.
So there's no cost on this particular slide.
Well, it's what drives the key insights, right? So it's what drives cost.
So what this shows is, for instance, on the blue line is single family. It shows on the y-axis the ratio of their peak hours, so their maximum hour demands on the system, the highest demands they place versus their average. And what this shows is that during those seasonal months, the blue line it's a little over 11. So their demands are about 11 times in that peak hour what their average demands are. And then the other customer classes are a bit below that. So they don't have quite as much seasonal usage, but you can still see there are seasonal changes across the year.
So if I read correctly, in the single family residential, tier 3, tier 4, and tier 5 exceed the industrial costs, which industrial cost was at 285. Tier 3, 4, and 5 were more. So if you have a single family home that uses, let's say, 50,000 gallons, and you have an industrial user that uses 50,000 gallons, how does it cost more per gallon to support the single family user of 50,000 than it costs to support the industrial user of 50,000 gallons?
So what it is fundamentally is within the rates, we have a couple different structures in play, right? So in single family, you pointed out that we have tiers, right? And the tiers have consumption ranges in them, going for 5 tiers. And those tiers have been designed with certain usage in mind. So the first few tiers are for indoor usage. And then as we move up, there's outdoor usage considerations, looking at the average lot and a large lot. And then the 5th tier for all extra usage. And we're able to do that on single family because single family homes are very homogeneous. They look very similar to one another. They have very similar occupancy. And so those tiers are able to better differentiate usage and price that usage according to its cost on the system. Now you're comparing that to another customer class. I think you mentioned commercial, was it? What was the other
I
customer
believe it
class?
was industrial was at 285. So
Okay.
3
Yeah.
of the single family tiers were higher than the flat industrial cost.
Yeah, and so I would point first to, when you look at this particular graphic, industrial's on the bottom of it. So industrial has the least changes in seasonal demands across the spectrum of the year that we're looking at here. Now we're updating all this analysis. We'll look how usage changes, but that rate is fundamentally calculated on the usage of the system. And so they are changing their usage less throughout the years and using less of those peaking functions.
I
And so-
understand, but what I'm saying is if you have one user using 50,000 gallons and you have another user using 50,000 gallons, the load on the system should be the same. They're both using 50,000 gallons.
So the big difference, it's a great question. So the big difference here in the comparison you're making is the industrial user is using that very consistently throughout the year. They're going to pay for 50,000 gallons all months of the year, looking at this type of a graphic. They don't change their usage that much. The single family, though, they're going to 50,000 gallons in some months, and then it's dropping off and coming back down. We still have to build the system to meet that, though, throughout the year. So the system has to be sized.
I understand, but a drop off would be less wear and tear on the system than a consistent 50,000 gallons every month.
No, so utility systems are very unique in that many of the costs are fixed. We've installed pipes and treatment systems that have to meet that demand. And so when they're empty, they're still there. We can't uninstall the capacity. It's there all year round. And so that is a very unique feature of these utility systems. And it's encapsulated in the way that these costs are apportioned.
So where I'm going is there's been multiple lawsuits in California and now also in Tucson that has said that tiered rates are unconstitutional and they're not directly related to cost. There's probably 5 municipalities or more that I've found in California that have outlawed the tiered rate structure. Pima County filed a suit against Tucson in December of 21. I don't know what the outcome of that lawsuit is currently, but I can't see where a single family home using 50,000 gallons has to pay a 3, 4, or 5x multiplier over an industrial user based on a cost basis. And that's where I think the whole structure is problematic. And where I'm coming from, I happen to live in an old growth pecan grove. So we have high usage water to try to keep the trees alive. So that's my perspective. But at that, I'll defer to the others on the call.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to your last comment, I think it's a really good comment because across the country you do see a number of lawsuits and various analysis going into rates, communities changing rates. The standard that is being used in Tempe, we've actually used this exact same standard in California at those much higher standards of cost allocation and cost identification to set these rates. So they would pass muster in California with some of the highest legal standards in the country.
By the way, there's 5 different municipalities where they've not passed muster, and it was declared non-constitutional. And in fact, in one particular one, there was a $2.7 million refund that the city had to pay based on their previous tiered rates.
Yep. And so there are different ways to set the tiers. And in this case, they happen to be tied directly 100% to the cost. And we go through a very detailed process to make sure that's true.
it's impossible for you to tell me that the same an industrial manufacturer using 50,000 gallons is 2/3 less expensive than a residential using 50,000 gallons. I have a hard time buying that.
Well, maybe we'll move on to another question, but thanks for your comments, Mark. We appreciate that. Okay, so another one, it says, are you finding new inadequacies in stormwater diversion capacities? And will those new construction projects be paid for by any new rates?
Laura, can you repeat that real quick? I'm sorry.
Sure. Are you finding new inadequacies in the stormwater diversion capacities? And will those new construction projects be paid for by any new rates?
That's a great question. I'm happy to address that question. So we do have a capital program for our stormwater infrastructure. A couple of those infrastructure projects have actually been moved up as part of this budget cycle because there is certain neighborhoods, I believe they're in North Tempe, which lack the adequate infrastructure for certain rainfall events to keep water from going into yards and so forth. So we are including those costs as part of this rate study. So those will be included in the stormwater costs moving forward. They'll be bonded, and the debt service will be part of the cost that associated with stormwater infrastructure in the study. Hopefully, I've answered your question.
Bryce, does that answer it for you?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, another question. Is there any consideration for stormwater to be used for irrigation, non-potable water?
That's another great question. I believe the city is considering green stormwater infrastructure study master plan coming up in the near future. So that could be a building block on top of what we're considering as part of this rate study. But this being our first foray into stormwater and identifying stormwater costs, we don't have any of that type of infrastructure currently built into our cost identification, and that those costs would have to be identified as part of that study.
Does anyone else have a question? I'm not seeing any in the chat. You can unmute yourself right now if you'd like. Okay. Well, I guess you guys have done a pretty good job of answering them so far anyway. Still not seeing any in the chat. We want to remind everyone too that we'd love for you to take the survey. You can go to tempe.gov/forum and you will see the survey there. It's not too long, and we appreciate you taking the time to give us your input there. Mark, you dropped off for a minute, but you're back. Did you have anything further to add before we end for today? Oh, I see here one from Kelly too. It would be interesting to offer credits to those growing things like a pecan farm, green areas, etc. Anyone want to take that one? All right. It's not really a question, but more of a comment.
Yeah, Laura, I can, and it's not a question, you're right, but we do appreciate those types of comments. Any comments you have, any recommendations, suggestions, I do want to let everyone know we consider all input and look at it, and the feedback that we get, if we can incorporate it into the rate study, we will have an answer for that. And if we can't, we could also let you know why it wasn't able to be incorporated. But please keep those type of questions and comments coming. We do appreciate it and need that during the rate study process. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Anybody else have a question or would like to make a comment? Okay, well, we finished a bit early, but that's okay. This recording will be posted on tempe.gov/utility rate study. You can find a link to the survey there as well, or tempe.gov/forum is a little bit more direct if you like that. Okay, well, thanks everyone for attending and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.